All right, now I'd like to welcome to the show Chris Koopman, my longtime friend, president and co-founder of the Abundance Institute. Welcome to Free the Economy, Chris.
Richard, thank you for having me.
Ah, fantastic. Well, we got a lot to talk about, but before we get into the politics and sociology and economics of abundance, uh, tell us how you got here, sort of career-wise. What was your path here, working on these issues, and what led you up to starting this exciting new organization?
Oh, this is good. So we can start at the beginning. We'll go back to the very beginning of my career. I showed up in Washington, D.C. in 2012 and decided I'm a lawyer by training, and decided I was going to do campaign finance. My first job in DC was campaign finance. That lasted about 90 days, and I realized that was a horrible mistake. I was not built for that. No one wants a person in a compliance role who wants to question the fundamental assumptions of why the law is there. So there was a natural tension there when they were like, just comply, and I was like, but it's a weird law. We should challenge it. And they're like, that's not your job. Um, so I quickly realized I was not built for that, and left that role and took an internship at the Mercatus Center. Started at the Mercatus Center and worked there for about 8 years. Worked my way up from the factory floor on the research side of the house, from intern to project manager to program director, ultimately running the tech policy program at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Left that and moved my family out to Utah to help launch the Center for Growth and Opportunity at Utah State University. We did that for about 5 years. And then about 18 months ago, really this moment when Chat GPT took the world by storm and sort of redefined how people thought about AI and really set off this entire debate about large language models and the future of artificial intelligence, it was really an opportunity for us as an organization. We had a tech team there, and it was an opportunity for us to think about how we positioned ourselves in the market, and broadly speaking, how people who are advocates for permissionless innovation positioned ourselves in the market. If you recall, that was it kind of caught those of us who are pro innovation a little flat footed, right?
Mhm.
There was this like very quick techno panic that occurred, and I think caught some of us by surprise. And I think we spent some time thinking about, okay, how do we not let that happen again as a movement, as an organization, as individuals, and settled on this idea of, look, if we really want to do this the right way, we need to start something new and different. And so we undertook the process of launching the Abundance Institute. I convinced some of my colleagues at the Center for Growth and Opportunity to join me on this path. And April, so about 5 months ago, we launched the Abundance Institute.
Fantastic. So for people who might not be familiar with this terminology, maybe we need to even unpack what some of these terms mean. And I feel like I've been part of this sort of economic cultural idea of abundance for a while, talking about it on the show here, and my Twitter bio reads part of it is promoting a new abundance agenda. So I'm bought in. But what does that really mean? And so I think I'll specify from my side that, abundance for me isn't what some people might kind of imagine it, which is just a mindless production of as many consumer objects as possible. Like it doesn't mean that we have a trillion handbags or cars or lamps or that necessarily.
Mhm.
For me, it means sort of just removing the barriers to producing whatever it is that people want, need, willing to pay for, or willing to produce themselves, and that it is an abundance of objects and services, but also of personal choice. So for me, that's sort of like the two big sides of it. When, as the head of an organization with the word abundance in your name, what does that term really mean to you?
Yeah, and I agree with you. I think in the broadest sense, I think when most people think about abundance, they just think about, just broadly speaking, material abundance, more of everything, more stuff. I think from a policy perspective, the concept of abundance really means more of the things that help people achieve self-actualization, human flourishing. So you have people who are talking about more housing. We have people talking about breakthroughs in healthcare. We have people talking about more better cheaper food, making life more affordable. From our perspective, when we talk about abundance at the Abundance Institute, really what we're talking about is the role that emerging technology can play in advancing step changes in our economy and thereby in our society. So really we're a narrowly focused group on removing barriers and unlocking the potential that emerging technology has to drive change, positive change in our economy and our society, and that's in AI, specifically in energy, specifically, and then next year we will be rolling out a health and biology focus as well.
Nice. You know, and this sort of leads into, the next thing I was thinking about, which is that a lot of the problems we talk about these days in sort of economics and public policy aren't really traditional problems of economics, which is more about limited resources, like limited land, limited resources, limited human capital, which is like not having enough, manganese or bauxite or whatever it is for some like strategic purpose. And that the problems we're facing here are a lot of self-imposed restrictions, like again, we sort of mentioned housing and energy production, by which we could get more of what we want and need by eliminating constraints rather than necessarily needing to find more stuff, period. And
Mhm.
I know like my colleagues Fred Smith and Wayne Cruz, they both really like the saying when it comes to economic productivity. You don't have to move the you don't have to teach the grass to grow, you just have to move the rocks off the lawn. And I wonder, when you're looking kind of broadly at these questions, like how much of the challenge we face is about sort of hard physical constraints, maybe we need to find more rare earth minerals or whatever, and how much is it about just bad decisions holding us back?
Yeah, I think it's more about removing the bottlenecks than it is sort of the technological constraints. I think human ingenuity will always do what it does, and that is going to find new ways to continue to increase all sorts of things, make life better. And I think unconstrained, that's what humans. That's what the entirety of human history has been a story of that. You look at like energy, for example. It's not a lack of rare earth minerals. It's not a lack of, of the ability to generate energy. These are self-imposed constraints that we're actually trying to get ourselves back to some sanity here. Think nuclear energy, for example. For 50 some odd plus years, we have more or less through culture and through policy have imposed a ban on nuclear. We could be at a point in the 1950s. There were people, very serious people, talking about a future in which energy was too cheap to meter. Right, the head of the Atomic Energy Commission said it is not too far to think, not too much to think, that in our children or grandchildren's lives we will have energy too cheap to meter. Now, 1954, that would be today, right? Those were our grandparents. They assumed that you and I, Richard, would be living in a world in which energy would be too cheap to meter, and it turns out energy prices have gone up. Now, why is that? These are self-imposed constraints. These are not a lack of human ingenuity. This is not a lack of innovation. And really, what our focus is to break through those barriers and unlock the potential that new and old innovation has to get us in a position where we are in fact achieving the types of goals that we used to set for ourselves as a society.
Well, yeah, and I think that the nuclear technology example in the United States is a really great one. So we had at one point we had the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission, um, that was the main federal agency involved with making decisions about this sort of stuff. And then we in the mid 1970s we got a new agency called the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And so at that time there was kind of a shift in how we approached nuclear energy. People were some people were they're anti-war people, and so they sort of didn't like nuclear technology, even the peaceful energy producing stuff, at all. And so there was kind of a political backlash against nuclear overall. But the idea was that excuse me, that the this new approach, the new NRC approach, would really focus on safety more than anything else. Safety first, which seems, I think, probably reasonable to most people. Like we do want a future where we're safe from terrible harms. But we managed to create a situation where we like throttled advances in the industry so much that we got virtually no innovation, including a lack of innovations that would have created safer technology itself, right?
Mhm.
So, and that and that is something obviously was not an outcome that was not intended by the policymakers in the mid 1970s, and it probably wasn't intended by any of the people who supported those moves, but it was a very real, demonstrable, we can point to how this happened effect. And I think, that more than anything is goes to all of these questions about, well, we've got these two new technologies, people are anxious about them, people are worried about them, and then we might,
Mhm.
overregulate them. And often that that overregulation is considered a sort of like free value, or it's like a no cost thing. If we're just extra safe, we don't have to worry about being extra safe because everyone's like safety. Except
Mhm.
that when you do that, you kill off all these other potential good things that you would also want.
Yeah, and I think it's also a really important story in like timing and focus of regulation. So, very early on, right? We're 10, 20 years really into the development of nuclear energy or nuclear power as a source for energy. The federal government stepped in and said it needs to be regulated and regulated specifically to focus on safety, right? The NRC has a very clear safety mandate. They're a safety agency, and it turns out they achieved safety. No one in the United States has died from a nuclear accident um, in the NRC's entire history. But it also turns out that we went something like 50 years without a new nuclear reactor going online. We only
Mhm.
took reactors offline. We never put them online. So it just depends on what you're maximizing. You're right. We spent the better part of you know 60 years maximizing safety at the expense of innovation, at the expense of energy security, energy cost, all sorts of other things that we could be balancing here, and we got a perfectly safe nuclear industry by destroying it. Right? And that doesn't. I mean, some of nuclear has. I don't even want to say succeeded in spite of itself, but still, there's I think like 20% of all electricity consumed in America comes from nuclear. Now it's primarily like three states, like Illinois and a few others. But you really think we cut off this entire line of innovation and really imposed these constraints on our economy and on our energy sector in the name of safety. And we do this all the time with emerging technology, right? We construct these doomsday scenarios, we regulate around them, and then we forego all of the immense benefits that could have occurred, right? And that's just sort of a story of regulation around emerging tech in America.
Well, yeah, I know you mentioned about the areas that the Abundant Institute is going to go into in the future. And one of the ones that CEI has worked on for a long time is, health and safety and pharmaceutical drugs, medication, and the Food and Drug Administration, right? So
Mhm.
the FDA and the NRC aren't, they have different missions, but they're both sort of, safety focused. And one of our arguments is that, you want drugs that are both effective but that are safe. And, the FDA would say, well, that's our job. We do balance those two things, but there's always going to be a point at which that balance could shift. And the question is whether shifting it in one direction or another will create greater overall benefits. Because we've always said that if there's a drug that gets approved today and everyone is standing up and applauding about how great this new drug is because it's going to start saving lives tomorrow, the question is how many people died yesterday or the month or year before while we were waiting for it to be approved. Um, and the answer is not, I don't think, any safety and efficacy testing or review, of course, but
Mhm.
it's also, I think, important to understand the sort of psychology and incentives of people that have those jobs that are running those agencies, right? Because the point of asking that rhetorical question is no one really sees the people
Mhm.
who died yesterday waiting for this drug to be approved. But if there is uh, a dramatic problem where someone takes a recently approved drug and they have a major negative reaction to it, that does make the news, right? It doesn't make
Correct.
the person who is in the news life more important, but
Mhm.
decision
Yeah,
makers are often more afraid of bad news than they are of
and
things that no one really knows about.
the commissioner of the FDA is not gonna be hauled before Congress for not approving a drug. They will be hauled before Congress for approving unsafe drugs, right? So their incentive is to err on the side of disallowing safe as opposed to approving unsafe, right? This is sort of type one versus type two errors. You see that all the time, especially in the NRC, the FDA, those that really have a safety mandate. But you're also seeing this emerge in the AI space. I don't think it is a stretch to say that likely the largest breakthroughs in healthcare, right? The cure for cancer will probably come through AI. Right? I'm willing to bet that against anyone who wants to take that bet that we'll find probably the most um, the most meaningful breakthroughs in solving some of these intractable health problems in the United States that will save people's lives will come through AI. And yet there is a very large subset of the population that is willing to forego that potential benefit in the name of protecting against this sort of long tail, low probability event of existential risk or something like this from AI. So I think it isn't just in the nuclear or the pharmaceutical space. I think all sorts of industries have been plagued with this sort of risk aversion that really and it's really hard to measure the foregone benefits, right? When you say, but we saved all of humanity. So what's it worth?
Well, I mean, that's a good point about that there are lots of examples and cases where you can sort of apply this construct to. A lot of them, fortunately, didn't get held back because there's a video on the Abundance Institute website which I've recently viewed. You are the star of it. Both your face on video and your voice is voiceover. But I think so. This video, I think, does a great job of sort of summarizing the institute's approach to sort of technology and public policy. But I especially like the section it was about previous innovations that today we sort of see as familiar, valuable, mostly harmless most of the time, but that at the time they were introduced were seen by a lot of people as dangerous threats, and there were really big concerns about them, including such doomsday inventions as the telephone, the bicycle, the automobile, the radio, video games, cell phones, and on and on and on and on. And so when you go back, Jason Pfeiffer at Entrepreneur Magazine is great about he talked about this a lot um, about the pessimists of centuries and decades past
Hmm.
about how their concerns about these again today very everyday ordinary inventions sound so overheated and melodramatic today. People talking about how bicycles are going to like ruin a woman's reproductive system, to take just one dramatic example from 100 years ago. Uh, but when we have, but when we hear very similar panicky warnings today, we take them all seriously. But we can look at the
Hmm.
ones from 50 or 70 or 100 years ago and say, "Oh, well, of course that was ridiculous. Those people are crazy." Is it just it's just hindsight, or is there a way that we can say, "Oh, well, the panicky predictions of today are probably just as basically as the panicky predictions 90 years ago about radio." Can we point to that?
Oh yeah, totally. I think I think we will look back and not in a long time. I mean, this isn't like we have to look, the concern about bicycles is 170 years old or something like this at this point. And I think that concern does seem silly. The idea of bike face, right? You mentioned the woman's reproductive, or that there would be permanent physical damage. I mean, early bikes were called bone rattlers, right? But they were early innovation, and it's like, well, the innovation didn't stay in that spot; it continued to get better, right? It's the case for long-term optimism. I think the same case can be applied to technology today. Like, obviously, the first bike was not perfect, right? Obviously, the privacy protections of the early telephone were not as strong as the privacy protections we have on our iPhones today, right? Like comparing them. it does make the historical panics seem silly, and some of them just are. Autonomous elevators just seem silly. That at one point in time, people were worried what would happen to you and I, Richard, if we were in an elevator without another human steering it for us,
Right. When
right?
you say autonomous elevator, you don't mean an AI powered elevator. You just mean an elevator that where you can press your own buttons
Yes, an
without
elevator
a
that does not have a human. You used to like turn it on and it would run, and then the person would have to stop it at the right time, and they'd open the door for you. This is like a an elevator that does not run with a human controlling every facet of it in real time. There were very real debates about whether or not we should remove human drivers from elevators. Right, these things just go up and down. It was the fear was, well, we'll get stuck between floors or something, and that does happen on rare occasions. But the techno panic itself is kind of silly. It's hard in the moment to separate yourself from that and see it. I think the conversation around AI today, I mean, you think there are people who are saying, well, obviously AI will make some things better for adults, but children shouldn't have access to it because it's going to make them lazy and stupid. It's going to make everything like they're just going to get all their answers from AI, in the same way that likely people thought about the internet, when the internet came around, or the proliferation of any other type of technology that made life better, right?
like
Thomas Jefferson writing to his daughter from France in the early 1800s, telling her, you need to make sure you make your own candles, right? If you rely too much on other people, you're sort of losing your humanity. Like, go be a yeoman farmer. It's good for you. And I think that pasteurism, this idea of like self-reliance is fine, but doing that at the sake of advancing society is not okay. Um, and I would add one more thing, Richard. There's this creeping pessimism in society in which I think more and more people are becoming more and more convinced that our best days are behind us. Things are only going to get worse. I mean, we ran this poll about a year ago when we were really thinking through this concept of abundance, and we asked Americans just when would you suggest a person be born to have a fulfilling life? 200 years ago, today, or 200 years in the future. Now, most people, a plurality, right, said today, but then between the people who were choosing 200 years in the past or 200 years in the future, more people said they'd rather be born 200 years ago than 200 years in the future, which is terrifying. 1824, infant mortality high, life expectancy low, civil rights non-existent for a lot of the people living in the United States, and not really a peak civilization moment, right?
yeah,
Like, things have only gotten better. You look at the hockey stick of human prosperity. We were just sort of
just
hitting
barely
that
taken up.
upwing, right? And there are a lot of people, like 20% of people we polled, right, would say that they would rather be born 200 years ago than any other time. And that's troubling. And it's more than just a techno panic about today. I think it's people have lost faith in 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 the future, and people really truly believe that our best days are behind us, and anything from here on out is only going to be worse. And that's another thing at the Abundance Institute we're really trying to push back on.
Well, yeah, especially when, like you said, the sort of, graph of human prosperity, whether it's, wealth or longevity or education or child mortality going down, any of these things, we've seen dramatic, very obvious, demonstrable increases in all of those sectors of quality of life. So, on the one hand, you wonder what could make people so pessimistic they think it would be better to be born 200 years ago. I mean, obviously, part of that is just because human beings have a sort of golden age mentality about either the time they were born or the time their parents or grandparents were born. In almost every human civilization, you find people write about how great things used to be and they're not as great today. It's easy to be nostalgic, or sort maybe nostalgia is not even the real word, but it's easy to overvalue quality of life in a time you never had to endure or live in, right? I
Yeah,
think, if people would be say like, oh, they would maybe say something vague like, oh, there was better civic virtue in, the 1820s. It's like, well, but there also wasn't indoor plumbing, or penicillin. So, um, but never having had to like deal with that reality, it's sort of easier to look back with sort of rose-colored glasses and sort of think of the things that might have been better and kind of ignore the things that would have obviously been terrible.
Yeah, yeah. Talk is cheap, right? Like
Mhm.
no one has to go live 200 years in the past. So people get to say, yes, I would rather be born 200 years ago. Um, but I do think that that creeping pessimism is really showing itself in the way we think about technology, the way we think about the future, the way that people are willing to take entire breakthroughs in innovation and spike them in their infancy because they're just afraid, right? Like fear isn't okay. It is something that has gotten us through a millennia, right? Like we have survived as a species because fear has helped us stay away from danger. But it's 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 fear. Fear needs to be responded to correctly, and I think it's fine to like avoid danger, but it's not okay uh, to take that fear and let it be the predominant posture for how we think about the future, the foundation for how we regulate technology. The problem with that fear is, it's infected everything, from the halls of Congress to media to our not just news media, but our popular media, to our dinner time conversations. Like everything has become sort of fear based and sort of constrained zero sum thinking where people really I think truly are beginning to believe that the only reason why people innovate is to make things worse.
Yeah, I mean, the question of, how do you respond to situations where you're fearful? Uh, if, a stranger breaks into your house in the middle of the night and they're wearing a hockey mask and they have a big knife in their hand, it would be reasonable for you to like run screaming in the other direction. But it's not reasonable for you to run screaming in the other direction from every normal stranger you meet on the street during the day. Right.
Yeah,
That would be an overreaction.
if you're a caveman and there's fire in your cave that you didn't put there, it's probably okay for your initial reaction to be fearful, right?
Mhm.
If you are using it to cook meat so you can sustain yourself and your family so you can stay alive, um, or stay warm, right? Survive a cold winter's night. Um, like fire is what has kept us alive, but fire can also kill you. And I think there's plenty of other innovation that, in the right hands will could double, triple life expectancy. In the wrong hands could certainly cause problems, but I think you have to have a measured approach to how we think about this and not say, well, I'd rather not double my life expectancy just
Mhm.
on the off chance that it may also be used to shorten someone else's.
Well, yeah, also the fact that these aren't, to the extent that they're public policy questions, they're questions of what regulation or law the government is going to pass. You're not deciding just for yourself. You're deciding for everyone else in society and everyone else who is born after you.
Correct. Yeah. And there's plenty of, I mean, no one entertains conversations anymore about banning cars. There was a very early conversation about, the automobile is too unsafe, right? There were actually at one point in time you had flag wavers, right, that would go ahead of the car and wave flags so people would clear the way to get out of the way of an automobile.
That sounds like a great job, by the way. You get a lot of fresh air, you
Yeah.
get
Oh
some
yeah, yeah, yeah.
exercise.
Yeah, you definitely get your steps in. That's for sure. But I think as we've evolved as an economy and as the technology evolved, we realized, well, there is an appropriate amount of risk that people are willing to take. Most Americans get in a car every day and drive to work. No one thinks about the fact that, yes, also there are people who are going to get in their car to drive to work and not come home, right? And we should take steps to make driving safe, make drivers safe, make cars safe. But no one entertains conversations about should we ban vehicles. Yet we do that with every new version of a technology that comes out. I mean, now we're talking about banning AI, right? We're talking about advances in other areas where people are very seriously entertaining like just stop it, pause it, turn it off. It's just not worth the risk. And yet I can't think of a single historical example where we shut off a line of technology and we're happy we did so, or didn't shut off a line of technology and wished we had.
Mm.
To your question about the techno panics, I can't
Yeah.
think historically of an example where we were like, gosh, we got that one wrong,
Yeah, I
right?
mean, we could have banned pinball in the 1950s when we had a chance, but it ruined teenagers forever, and now now there's no going back.
Or skateboarding or pagers or smartphones, right? There's been all of these things that they've said we should ban them to save kids, and we didn't ban them. And it turns out the kids are okay, Richard. They turned out
Well, also
fine.
even but even in that case, that's a kind of a good example of kind of risk management rather than risk avoidance, maybe, rather than sort of managing the technology for its best use rather than banning it entirely. Uh, we haven't banned cell phones. We haven't banned cell phones like sort of nationwide as a law for kids, but plenty of schools these days are saying, well, kids can't have cell phones on them during class time. You have to put them in a like little lockbox or something. And whatever you think about that ex
Yeah,
specific example, uh, it is uh, it is an example of how we can sort of titrate our responses, right? We can say this technology is good and useful here, but maybe we want to restrict it in this other place and in certain situations for certain ages in sort of granular ways, without saying no one under the age of 18 is allowed to touch a smartphone ever.
right. Yeah, but even then, I think I think if a kid is using a cell phone in a classroom to cheat on a test, I think everyone would agree. Probably misuse of the technology. I think just having the technology. We did this in the 80s and 90s. Well, the 90s, pagers, right? Pagers. There was this whole war on pagers in the American education system in an effort to. And actually, New Jersey still has. It's still a crime to bring a pager to a school in New Jersey. We criminalized pagers in an effort to. It was a symbol of drug culture. It was it was a way in which the youth were being scandalized by, I don't know, connecting with one another. There were a lot of arguments as to why it was degrading the classroom environment, and there doesn't seem to be any good evidence that like actually banning pagers, criminalizing pagers made kids better off in school. And there are some really high profile examples from the time of of banning pagers actually led to turning like kindergartners into criminals, right? That there were actual elementary school kids who were taken out of school and in police custody because they brought a pager to school. Right?
Mm.
I think that's an over again, even in that context, I think people are still panicking. It's really easy to always sort of bring out the kids and say, we gotta protect the children. But typically the people saying that are one generation behind the technology, right?
Mhm. Take
It's
it
they're sort of in that age where where all new technology is new and foreign and evil and ungodly, right? They're not in that sort of they still don't have that sense of wonder and openness to new technology. That's just a generational thing, and I think that's never going to stop. I don't
mhm.
think we'll change that, but at
Well, take
least
it, listeners,
contextualizing some of these, yeah.
take it from a guy with multiple adorable young children. Chris cares about the kids. He just believes in technology too. Um, because if I said we shouldn't regulate to spare the children, people say, well, you don't have any kids. Yeah, what would I care what you think? But Chris has plenty of kids, so
I've
you
got
know
yeah, it's 6, 9,
it's
7,
it's good.
6,
More at any
4,
point. Who
3,
knows?
1. I've got lots of kids that are in that sort of we must protect them from technology phase, and I think properly presented, many of these technologies are wildly helpful, and frankly, you know, ChatGPT, for example. I mean, the things that my 7 and my 9-year-old think to use ChatGPT for that I would never. I think we're just beginning to scratch the surface of how humans and artificial intelligence are going to interact in this like wildly fascinating, creative, and productive way.
Yeah. So before we finish, I definitely want to get into the this view of specifically of artificial intelligence applications being potentially dangerous, sort of asymmetrically dangerous compared to other more other common technologies. So, a lot of the debates here seems to be infused with these sort of scary scenarios from like science fiction or even like, horror films, that killer robots and things. And, and so I was thinking about this, earlier this year when I was reading an excellent op-ed by your distinguished colleague Taylor Barkley uh, about that one was called "Don't Use Science Fiction to Inspire Public Policy on AI," and that title is a good summary of his argument. Um, but I think that was sparked by some story about how the Joe Biden and his like White House team was at Camp David and they watched some movie that had some scary robot in it, and then someone gave a comment to a reporter about, oh, we should really be looking closer at this AI stuff. He was saying like, well, that's if that's the reason why you're worried, then maybe you should rethink your worries. And so the, you know, there's one, we shouldn't be letting scary science fiction tell us what to think. But more importantly, there's uh, a lot of different sort of technological applications here that are very sort of commonplace, and that very few of them actually have anything to do with like Terminator 2 scenario. Uh, I was just reading an example of someone who said, "Oh, I just cobbled together this new, software solution using AI that allowed us to take these like large data sets that we used to like take 5 hours every day for us to like sort through, and now it only takes 1 hour." Amazing, right? So, our Excel spreadsheets don't choke every time we try and sort this data. And
Mhm.
I feel like that is like an application like that, which is not dramatic and sexy and sort of, like, oh, it's going to save the world. Uh, but it's also not going to end the world. And I feel like 99% of AI applications, you know, are a lot more like that than they are about reprogramming NORAD to, autonomously fire missiles or something.
Yeah, yeah, and I think, like, most people are interacting with some version of AI all the time.
Mhm.
And they're not these scare I mean, the fraud detection in our financial system is mostly automated. I think most people would say, like, they prefer that if their credit card information is stolen and thereby their information is misused, that it's flagged early and not after, like, their credit cards have been maxed out, right? I think most people like that. You look at the trust we have in downloading apps on our in the Apple ecosystem or on Google Play with the verified. Like, most of the verification of those apps to ensure compliance with the rules of the app stores are done autonomously. They're not done by humans are not screening every single app that comes in, right?
Right.
A lot of this is being done in an automated way. And that's what, like, fosters this trust in downloading these apps. Even Google Maps, right? I think most people, like, finding a coffee shop near you, right, is actually a use case in AI all the time, right? What's the best way to get there, right? Like, people who are constantly using AI to avoid traffic through Google Maps or Apple Maps. These are all applications of some version of AI that people have really come accustomed to, right? Now, I think I don't know what the productivity gain of America has been as a result of, like, avoiding traffic over the last 10 years. Somebody could do that math and realize how much time has been saved just by Google Maps. And I think the folks that want to take an aggressive stance toward AI need to explain why we shouldn't have those things, as
Mhm.
opposed to how they're saving us from some doomsday scenario of, like, a Terminator like AI hacking our electricity grid and shutting down our system. I mean, frankly, that is all based on a wild misunderstanding of how our grid works, right?
Mhm.
There more outages are caused by squirrels than terrorists, right? Like, our grid is fragile, just not in the ways that we think it is.
Right. I mean,
And
some of
and
the
and
squirrels may also be terrorists. We don't know, but
well, yeah, I mean, obviously they're causing massive amounts of human suffering, and we
mm,
shouldn't stand for it. Like, I'm not pro squirrel at all. And so I do think that, like, we need to have a proper sort of estimation of risk in the right direction. And oftentimes it's really easy to go after these big shiny scary things and say, well, I just watched a movie, or I saw an episode of Black Mirror, or my brother-in-law just told me about this horrible thing that he just read about, and I think we need to do something about it. Unfortunately, that's how a lot of regulations written in America.
mhm.
Policymakers are just people, and I think folks like us are trying really hard to make sure that while people are afraid, they're not letting those fears become outsized, and certainly aren't allowing those fears to become the foundation for how we think about national public policy around really important things like innovation.
Well, yeah, but sort of going back to what we talked about before, even when it comes to safety. So we're talking about, balancing, safety with some other concerns. But even if you are just looking at safety itself, restricting AI could also make us less safe. I think if you look at autonomous cars, autonomous vehicles, autonomous driving, uh, there are, the Waymo experience, and then there's multiple companies that have, multiple track records of now they've got, millions of miles of autonomous driving data. And it virtually all shows that current generation AI driving is safer than human drivers, right? And so if you only going to become better in the future, right? With again, millions of miles of data and more fast computers crunching these numbers and tweaking the rules of engagement with autonomous vehicles out in the world. So if if you have a sort of safety-led worry about AI applications that leads to one of the most prominent AI applications that increases safety being done away with, then you haven't really served your initial purpose, right? And that's something that actually exists, not the scary made up thing that you heard about from your brothers-in-laws, friends, cousins, hairdresser.
Yeah, yeah, and we talk about a lot about this in sort of like the public policy, the nirvana fallacy, right? I think like people are totally willing to accept human error, oftentimes, right? What is it? Something 100 something odd people die a day uh, in cars in America because of accidents. And if we could wave a magic wand and say, what if that became zero or one person for every million miles driven? I think most people would say yes, but then we said, but that means then the proliferation of autonomous vehicles. And they would say, oh, but not that way, right? Like we accept zero error when it comes to sort of the technology, but we're more than willing to accept human error, and we're not trading off on the right margins. And I think you're absolutely right. The risk of not doing this sometimes outweighs the risk of doing it. Almost always outweighs the risk of doing it, not doing it. I said it backwards there, Richard. You know what I'm saying, right? Shutting this stuff down oftentimes is going to cause far more human suffering in the long run than
Right.
allowing it to proliferate. There's a finer way of putting it.
So here's a sort of final conundrum that I was thinking about, and because people get anxious about change, so it obviously makes sense to reassure people, that their worst fears about a new technology are unfounded when they are in fact unfounded. But sometimes I feel like the apologetics for tech kind of water down the potential. So telling people they don't need to worry about a new technology because it won't really change anything. Uh, One, that's probably not true. If it's significant technology, it probably will change some things. But on the other hand, it also makes people think there's nothing really revolutionary or valuable in the pipeline.
Hmm.
And so that to me, that's also a sort of like balancing act because you have a lot of tech evangelist people, Silicon Valley people, programmers, futurists, who get all excited about these, dramatic new possibilities, and they go out and talk about them, and then those enthusiastic predictions of what's coming causes some people to be nervous. And so I feel like the response on some people's part is, "Oh, don't worry, don't worry. It's not going to be that different. It won't be that weird."
Mm-hmm.
But part of what makes people excited about innovation in the first place is that it will have a big positive difference.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. And I think you're right. This is, you mentioned Jason Pfeiffer earlier. This is something I've that it's come up in conversation with him as we talk about how people evangelize technology and think about sort of future proofing yourself, thinking about how we fit into this world. And there's this interesting story, right? The microwave oven didn't replace the actual oven, right? Yet you could have people out there that could say, well, you could cook anything in it. You don't need an oven. You only need a microwave. You could make a turkey in the microwave. You could, in fact, make a turkey in the microwave.
Mhm.
It would not be good, right? It probably wouldn't taste good. It's certainly not going to be edible. You can eat it. It will not. It will
The
not kill
dog, the
you.
dog, the dog would love it.
It will not taste good, right? The texture will not be there. That's not the perfect or the right use of that technology. And I think oftentimes what you see, Richard, is people who are evangelizing for the tech sometimes, treat it as like a one size fits all solution for everything,
Mm,
right? My tech is going to fix all the problems. And in some ways actually sort of do a disservice to the technology because one, you sort of you hype it to the point where people are afraid. They're like, well, a technology powerful enough to do all of those things could potentially do all these other things. Now
mm,
explain yourself. Or they hype up the technology and then people end up disappointed, right?
mm,
And they're like, well, you said it was going to do all this stuff and it didn't, and we believed you, and why are you not achieving it? I find that to be far more risky than the people who are like, well, it's not going to be great. I'd rather people in the general population be more lukewarm about tech than these like full-throated boomers around some of this technology, because I do think if it almost creates this reflexive pessimism about it, right? As soon as someone's like, it almost feels too good to be true. Oftentimes because what they say are in fact too good to be true.
mm,
But then it sort of causes people to say, well, I have concerns, and you're telling me everything's going to be okay, but the whole world's going to change.
mhm,
Now that can't both be true, right? You're telling me everything's going to be fixed and there's no problems and nothing's going to occur, but it's going to be this all powerful technology that's going to do all sorts of stuff. In the long run, I think just having a measured optimism about these things is far more important, and I think far more powerful to having good substantive conversations around the tech than people sort of trying to tell you you can replace all the utensils in your kitchen with a microwave, right?
with one Cahoosits. Yeah,
Right.
I think that obviously if you're the one selling the technology, you want to make the point that it's as useful as, as applicable as possible. Um, uh, but but yeah, the maximizer, not everything that's useful needs to be maximized. So when you have we've had multiple generations now, I feel like certainly in generations of technology, maybe not in generations of humanity, of people selling you know, augmented reality or virtual reality goggle sets, right? And you might say someone who was really wanted to sell you on, augmented reality, visualization would say, "Oh, you can keep it on all day. You can wear it all day. And you can do this and you can go to work and you can meet your friends and you can like go to the metaverse and you can do this other stuff and you can play games and you just never have to take them off." And I think a lot of people would say, "Well, that sounds like a nightmare. I don't want that."
Mhm.
And so that the sort of maximalist case for every single technology can, I think, like you said, be off-putting. And it doesn't have to be the solution to everything. It just has to be useful.
Yeah, yeah, and I do think that where our conversations, and this is maybe just the nature of how the partisan political conversations around everything have gone, but there's no moderation in any one direction. If you're not staking out an extreme position on something, I think oftentimes people think you aren't taking a position at all. Um, and so I think oftentimes in this way, and frankly, you're right. If I built a technology and I'm trying to sell it to the world, obviously I'm going to tell everyone that my technology is near perfect to fix any problem you have. Um, that just should be in the proper context of, well, that, as we think about the public policies around this, um, we should have, I think, a bit of a moderate a moderate thought around it, because I do think that's a lot of the fear around the tech is people believing that AI is the perfect example of this. You ask Jan LeCun, he'll tell you we're at very basic, rudimentary, early large language models. This is like dog and cat logic, I think is the way he's put it
Mm,
before. And yet the reason why I think a lot of people are afraid is because they're being told these are wildly powerful models that can do all sorts of things. And they can do a lot of things. But I think that in fact the people who are the largest proponents of the technology are oftentimes actually sort of stoking the fears inadvertently of the people who
mm.
are afraid. And I think just having like more objective, measured conversations around technology is just helpful on both sides.
All right. So this is our agenda for radical moderation.
Yeah, look. I think people should be optimistic. People should be very, very optimistic about the future. But I think people should also be measured in that optimism, and recognize like not everything is going to be perfect. We'll never achieve nirvana or perfection, right? And we need to accept, right, the case for long-term optimism. Accept imperfection in the short run as we continue to get better every day.
Excellent. That's a great summary, Chris. So, well, thank you for being with us. Well, this has been an amazing conversation that I will let have cause to refer to many times in the future. But before we go, tell everyone where to find all your stuff online.
It's easy. Abundance Institute can be found at abundance.institute.
I remember when there were only .coms, .orgs, and .nets, and now we got TLDs of every kind, even the very best kind, the .institute kind. Thank you so much for being with us, Chris.
Thank you, Richard.